Yep. Good evening, everybody. Hope you're all well. Just to start preamble, as this is being run as a hybrid meeting, please can I remind those participating via Microsoft Teams to only switch their camera and microphone on when asked by myself to address the committee and off at other times. Thank you. So we'll kick straight off. Apologies for absence.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Apologies from Shirley Boy, and Councillor Andy Croy is substituting this evening.
Thank you. And minutes of the previous meeting. Do we have any comments from the minutes of the previous meeting? Could I have someone to second them, please? Propose them. So David, and second Pauline, and then a vote, please. Unanimous. Declarations of interest. Any declarations of interest? Nope. Okay, moving on. Public questions.
No questions, Chair.
Okay. Next one, member questions. Any members?
Yeah, none received, Chair.
Okay. Right, so now we'll move on to the first major agenda item. So we've got the homelessness update. So start with Stephen to give us a quick brief chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. I'm just going to introduce the report. Salvacar's going to present it, and I'm sure he'll be able to answer your questions on any technical points. I want to really take this opportunity to thank the officers in the housing service for all they've been trying to do to tackle this problem of homelessness. I'm sure you're very well aware each of the cases of homelessness that present to us is a personal and family tragedy. You're also, I'm sure, also aware that because of our obligation to house the homeless, emergency accommodation often has to be used, and that is incredibly expensive. So there are two very good reasons for trying to reduce homelessness, both in terms of the human cost, but also in terms of the financial impact on the council. So those two objectives are very much in our minds. The report highlights some key causes, which I think you're all probably familiar with already. Family and relationship breakdowns, often, I'm afraid, compounded or sometimes compounded by domestic abuse, and an increasing incidence of private landlord evictions. This is probably one of the big causes of the current spike. The report also highlights measures that we're trying to take to address the problem. Obviously, the causes, I'm afraid we can't do much directly to intervene on the causes, but we can try to be as agile as we can in dealing with the consequences. And I want to particularly commend the work done by Zulfikar and his team in two areas. There are many areas I could commend, but I just want to highlight two. One is the really creative work led by Zulfikar himself on building up relationships with private landlords to try and secure more temporary accommodation. Temporary accommodation is the next stage after emergency. The more temporary you have, the less you rely on emergency. And Zulfikar's been doing some very creative work with the private rental sector to try and secure additional temporary accommodation from them. And I also want to commend the work that's been done to deal with rough sleeping, which has been very successful. In fact, so much so that it's now being nationally recognised and is really, I think, a beacon of excellence that the council can be very proud of. In fact, I think we can be very proud of the efforts made by our housing service to try and tackle this appalling problem. Some good news I wanted to also draw to your attention. We'll very, very soon be getting the first tenants moving into the first phase of the Grovelands development, which is excellent news. That's going to be a great blessing for the people who move in, but it's also, again, going to be immensely helpful in terms of saving the council money on emergency accommodation. Looking forward, there's a key opportunity for us with negotiations with the new registered providers. We're going through a process of negotiating for our preferred partners. Shirley's going to be involved in that process with me, and we're going to do our best to ensure that we use this opportunity to try and maximise the willingness of our partners to help provide more temporary accommodation and also more affordable housing generally, with the emphasis on social rental, which is the most important component. And also, and this reminds us of a subject that came up in the last full council meeting. We'll be using the planning process as best we can to secure the maximum number of affordable and social dwellings in the housing applications that come forward over the next few months and years. Thank you very much. So I'll hand over to Zulfikar. There's Zulfikar.
Thank you very much. Yeah, what I'm going to do is share a presentation which kind of captures some of the points, both in the report and gives you an idea of the current issues we're dealing with. I'm just going to try and share my screen with you. All right, just trying to get the presentation up. There we go. Does that come up? Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so just to say, this presentation is going to cover some of the issue that Stephen has already picked up, and the data in this, I'll be dating further in the presentation updated this evening, so it may not be in the package you've had, but at the time of going to press with this, these are the data we had. So just to give you an idea, really, basically, the current homelessness demand, which is from April, so it's to one, we had 239 applications and 199 of those were self-referrals. We've got referrals from agencies under duty, refer duty, and the figures are there, which I think I circulated in the presentation. So we've got currently 316 open cases, which are of which 142 are what we call in the approach stage, which is where we're actually looking and investigating their process cases. 40 cases are what we call advanced prevention stage, where we are very confident we will be able to prevent their homelessness cases, and 85 of those cases are what we call relief, where we will find solutions, either temporary, emergency, or private sector accommodation, and 42 are what we've accepted what we call a statutory homelessness duty. So if you take all that into account, that 42 figure is a result of good work by the staff and the team in trying to prevent homelessness and finding alternative solutions, which I'll talk about later on in the presentation. So this is a graph which is in your present pack as well, but the three main causes you will see, as Stephen has quite rightly pointed out, are basically end of a short-term tenancy, which are biggest cause, which is private landlords evicting, and there's a number of factors behind that. That includes landlords looking for higher rents, which they can get in the private sector compared to local housing allowance rents, which are the housing benefit clients. There's reasons a lot of landlords have lost tax subsidies and are pulling out of the buy-to-let market as well. The other reasons include basically landlords wanting to sell their properties and come out of the market completely. And we've started some work around that. For example, in the prevention bit, we asked landlords what their intentions are in terms of if they're evicting somebody, do they want to re-let it? Why are they evicting? Is it because purely for the rent? We try and negotiate on that basis, try and fill some of that shortfall that they're looking for. But it's, the market trends are basically they can get substantially more rent in the open market than they would get from a person on housing benefits. The second biggest cause is family and friend evictions, and some of this is kind of the knock-on effect from COVID, where, again, we did some preventative work. We persuaded families that that wasn't the right time to actually evict their son, daughter, or children or grandchildren. But a lot of that is now materialising into real evictions, and we have a statutory duty to present those. But I wanted to highlight the third one, which is domestic violence, because that is something that's rapidly increasing in this borough. It's compared to this time last year, it's almost doubled in terms of domestic violence cases. It may be linked to the other cause of family and friends evictions, but there's also relationship breakdowns, and the level of domestic violence is alarmingly increasing in this borough. So those are the three main causes of homelessness, and the rest are there for you to kind of absorb. Now, as Stephen said, this is a problem that is growing and will continue to grow. So we've done some projections, and our projections are basically between now and 2026, our homelessness demand is likely to double from where it is now. And that's because of market trends. That's because based on the current rate of applications we're getting. So this graph is something I use regularly, both internally and externally with other partners as well, to explain the huge pressures we are, and obviously what this will bring, and I'll touch on that a little later on in the presentation, will be financial pressures, because in many of these cases we will have no choice but to go what we call stage 1 emergency accommodation, which is quite costly. Moving on to the next. So this gives you an idea of rough sleeping and the way it's gone. So at one point, we had in 2015, we were at a peak of 17. We're actually down to 1 in 2020, and it had just slightly run to 4 at the moment. But that doesn't really tell the story, as Stephen has said. So during COVID, the government announced something called everyone in policy. Most local authorities had a choice whether to adopt that or not. Wokingham chose to adopt that policy, and we took in over 100 rough sleepers, and I'm really pleased to say that we've now moved the majority of those on. So that's kind of landmark work, basically, as Stephen said, to recognise nationally by the government in terms of good practice, and that involved intensive support, intensive one-to-one sessions, supporting some of those rough sleepers back into work, working with them on alternative options, and that number has really dropped massively as well. So again, on emergency accommodation, Stephen pointed out, we've got 2 kinds of temporary and emergency. Emergencies where somebody walks through the door, they've got nowhere to go, we have no choice but to place them in a hotel. That number again is 37. That tells a success story in itself. So I've been there just over a year. When I got here, we had 54 people. We're actually down to 34 as of this week, last Friday. So that has meant basically trying to reduce people from costly emergency accommodation and moving them into stage 2. And this gives you a breakdown, but on average, the length of stay is about 16.2 weeks, which is quite high, but it's still better than quite a lot of our neighbouring authorities as well. And this gives you a breakdown of the success story. We've got this Crown House. I'm not sure if many of you have heard, but that was a 24-unit building where we were paying around £60 a night, and we've negotiated that into a long-term lease and to reduce it to £32 a night. And that's basically one of the examples that Stephen mentioned we're doing with the private sector landlords, trying to reduce the costs of temporary accommodation. This gives you the latest figures. So we've had 17 people placed in on a month-by-month basis. On actually let accommodation is costing us £2,224 and £15,000 on average in 21-22. And the cost is obviously, I think, with the current financial situation, is a major factor where we are trying to tackle and reduce homelessness. And if you see, we are on a downward trend, but if you look at those demand figures, that cost will continue to rise. But at the moment, we've managed to tame it, and we've actually trying to get some sort of reduction in those costs, but it will continue to, if that demand continues to rise, unless some of the solutions that I've got in my last two slides, which I'll talk about, work, then we need to be aware that there's a risk that these costs could rise again. So again, we've got 75 people currently in temporary accommodation, and basically there's a breakdown there of there's 34. All of those are families, 41 are singles. We've got some statutory duties, 68 of those out of 75, and 7 are under discretionary powers. This gives you a breakdown of the funding from government, which is for the next 3 years. It was for the first time we've got 3-year settlement. I'm not going to dwell on that because I really want to talk to you about, and this is the rough sleeping funding. I wanted to focus on the last two slides, which are the solutions that we'll be working, and Stephen touched on some of these. So we've done a lot of work around trying to increase our preventative work, look at new measures to actually stop people getting into temporary accommodation, but also find tangible and sustainable solutions. And here we've listed some of the work that we've got: additional staff, we've got some specialist funding for domestic abuse, which I highlighted earlier on, one of the biggest causes. We've recently appointed a young person's officer, prevention officer, who's preventing a lot of those young people going into temporary accommodation, emergency accommodation. The new social housing allocations policy which came in April has been a real help, because it actually helped us focus on the most vulnerable and the most needy people in the borough. And Stephen mentioned the Grovelands project, which is about to kick in. We've got 22 units coming in there. That's modular housing, and if any members haven't seen it, we'd be happy to, take you to show that once it's operational. But that will bring 22 extra units, and it will help us reduce temporary accommodation in a big way. So this is kind of the innovation that Stephen touched on. Working up to about last year, had never really engaged or worked with private sector landlords and private rented sector. And this is work that we've kind of kicked off, and it is paying dividends. So we've set up what we call a landlord forum, where we've started discussions with landlords and letting agents. Given the shortage of social housing supply, that is our only source of alternative supply. So we've developed what we call a private sector offer for landlords, where we're offering to guarantee rents, offering long-term leases, offering post-tenancy support, tenancy sustainment support. And I'm really pleased to say that we've now got 10 properties around that. And if you look at an average cost of £10,000 for a temporary account, that's about 100k of saving in real terms. And that's just really the start. Our aim is to actually increase those private sector properties. So we're looking at innovation, for example, discharge. We've got statutory under the Localism Act, we've got powers to discharge duty, provided the accommodation is suitable and affordable. And that's the solution we're working on. Housing First was innovative, where we've got 4 properties let to entrenched draft sleepers, and it's another success story. Unfortunately, we applied for further funding from government, but we didn't get it. So that's kind of, if you like, a highlight of some of the work we're doing. But Stephen touched on the fact that currently, if you ask me as the head of service, basically we are heading in the right direction. We've managed to find some innovative solutions, but I think with the current levels of demand, with the economic situation, I think members need to be aware that there is a risk that this demand in homelessness could suddenly surge. And the other thing I haven't put in this presentation is the Ukraine situation, where we've now got nearly 200 guests in the borough, and potentially those could go through the homeless route, although we're very confident of not getting to that stage. And we are looking for alternative solutions as they come up to the end of their 6 or 12 months, basically. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, what I'm going to do is start around the table as usual, and start at this end. So, David.
My first question was going to be about the Ukrainian situation. You just answered that, but clearly that's one to watch as we go into next year. I noted your trend chart showing the likely increase in homelessness in the borough, and as a gut feel, it would be difficult to argue with that. I think we'd all sort of agree that times are looking bleak for the year ahead. But when I looked at your chart on current homelessness demand on page 20 of the pack we've got here, and I think it was the first chart that you showed, I didn't completely understand the numbers on that, but I felt it quite difficult to extrapolate from that the likely increase in demand. I don't know if you can add any more information into that. So I think I'm gonna feel that's going to happen, but the data behind the assumptions would be good.
Yeah, so the first, is this the one you're talking about, David?
That's right, yes.
Yeah, so this is going back to April. This was the information for April that we started with. So we have updated in, I think it was slide. This slide here gives you kind of monthly trend of the number of applications that are coming through the door. So what we're saying is basically that it's really fluctuating at the moment. So if you look at, for example, February we had 11, and in August we had July we had 22 applications. So that demand is fluctuating, and that's fluctuating. I mean, I can get breakdown of the different causes, but that gives you an idea. It's really fluctuating demand that's taking place at the moment.
So there's fluctuations, but not one single or two or three key things that we say were driving that particular.
Yeah, the three things that I think that Stephen touched on, private landlord evictions are definitely increasing, and they are on the increase as we speak. So I had a chat with the caseworkers this afternoon, and that is definitely an area that, so in most cases, landlords are not even willing to negotiate. They've decided they want out of the market. They can get better rents in the private rented sector. So, and the family evictions, some of which were post-COVID, are actually on the massive increase as well. But DV, those are three big causes.
Can I just, again, maybe me misunderstanding figures of it, and I apologise if that's the case, but on that first chart on page 20 with the homelessness demand,
Yeah.
and you talk about threatened with homelessness due to S21.
Yeah.
That data shows that the actual incidence going down, not up. And it's like,
Yeah, that's because of this. Yeah, I mean, if you look at, there's a figure on our prevention work. So we've increased preventative measures. So going back to this slide here, is that we've done 47 cases of prevention. So that's what I said. We've, out of the 316, we've managed to find alternative solutions, and we're actually 42 cases where we've accepted statutory duty. So even though demand is increasing, we're trying to prevent more. We're finding alternative solutions. So what we're talking, when we talk about demand, is where we have a statutory duty to accept applications. Don't know if that explains what you're asking.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Another question I had was on the actual target you have of 5 for homelessness in the borough. I wasn't quite sure, what was that, 5 per year, per month? And as a supplementary to that, a very unfortunate situation of a week ago, walking into the town centre on Sunday for lunch and encountering somebody sleeping rough in a shop doorway. To my total shame, I had no clue what to do about that. I mean, who do you ring on a Sunday to report the fact that someone's looks like they're in need of assistance? So the two questions there would be to what specifically routes of communication do we all have, or members of the public have, to report that sort of incidents? And can you just give some more clarity behind that number of rough, the target, if that's the right word, for dealing with rough sleepers?
Yeah, that's target of what we're saying at given time. There'll be no more than 5 rough sleepers in the borough. The case you referred to was actually picked up on Monday. That those people have been offered accommodation 3 times, and they're out of choice. So Susan, our chief exec, also saw them on a Monday. We had outreach teams going in the evenings, and every evening they visit them, but they have totally refused accommodation. We offered them 3 properties so far, 3, and they refused it. So they're there out of choice. So what, in terms of contact, there is a number, and I can circulate it through Connor again, that you can refer to. Out of hours, we have an out of hours emergency service. So where we have got out of hours street outreach team that can be contacted, and during office hours, we've got duty line where officers are available to pick up any imminent or current homelessness cases. But that particular case on the high street in the shop front has been there, I think, nearly 2 months, and they're refusing to move. And we've had specialist workers go to them. We've had 2 cents or our outreach support service go to speak to them, but they're not willing to move.
Perfect. Thank you for that.
Okay, moving on. Anybody else? No. Okay. So I'm just going around this table. So I'm looking, starting Al, you got.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Sulphur. Just a couple of questions. Could you just confirm sort of what the local connection that is needed for someone to present as homeless then in the borough? Do they have to have had a previous address in the borough for you to take on their cases?
Yeah, so the statutory requirement is to have a 3-year local connection. In our social housing policy, which was approved by members in April, we put a 5-year connection, local connection. Prior to April, anybody could have approached to join our waiting list. From now, since April, for the housing register, it's 5 years. For homelessness, statutory requirement is 3-year local connection.
Okay, thanks. And people who are homeless, I mean, can they retain sort of access to GP services and things like that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, moving on. Laura.
Thank you, Zulfikar and Stephen. I've got 2 quick questions and one which might be a bit longer. So on page 22, the current homelessness demand, mortgage repossession, that's at 0 at the moment, and it just covers January to August this year. Is that historically low? I'm just trying to work out the trends because obviously mortgage has been very much in the press.
It's definitely been historically low, and it was to do with the low interest rates. We are anticipating with the interest rates so that there will be an increase in that, and we're looking at trying to find solutions. For example, mortgage rescue caps options. So in the past, we worked with registered providers who provide what they call mortgage rescue, and we were already started some work in the last 6 weeks to try and build that discussion with the registered providers. But at the moment, historically, it's been very low.
Okay, thank you. And then the figures on the temporary accommodation. Is there a large proportion here which have been offered accommodation, which they've turned down because they haven't seen it as appropriate, or really is there nowhere really to find them? It's very difficult to find them accommodation at all.
It's been very difficult. So, for example, out of the people we've got in long-term temporary accommodation, 74 that I've had in this presentation, quite a lot of those are 2- and 3-bedroom cases, and there's quite a few 4- and 5-bedroom cases where it's been difficult to find suitable accommodation for them to meet their needs. And under law, it has to be suitable and affordable. Affordability is not an issue, but the suitability is a big issue because we've got children at school, some got exam age children. We have to take a number of those, including medical, a number of factors into account, some suitability, and that's what's the big issue. Again, we've reached out to our registered provider partners, and in recent times we've got some properties in, but no near to meet the demand.
Is that family that's been in temporary accommodation since 2017? That's such a long time ago.
Yeah.
Are they a rarity, or are there quite a few families in a similar position?
They're absolute rarity because they've got some specific medical needs. They've got specific needs in terms of community networks, and they've got very specific needs, which is why it's been really difficult to find a property that meets the suitability order.
Okay, thank you. And then the predictions of the homelessness numbers, what is the solution really? Is it more Groveland sites, or are there other alternative solutions that other councils are coming up with?
I think the big 3 solutions, the one is to provide more, as you say, Grovelands, that what we call modular housing. The biggest solution is to try and find alternative accommodation in the private rented sector. So we have, I mean, our neighbouring boroughs, for example, just to give you an example, Reading have discharged over 100 cases. We can do that, but the biggest thing is around with the economic pressures, the affordability. At the moment, the gap between market rents and private sector rents is huge. So some of the deals we've been negotiating with landlords has been to actually bridge that gap and offer at least 2 to 3 year tenancy, so that it's much better than keeping somebody in bed and breakfast or in temporary accommodation, because it helps them plan their lives. But the biggest solution would be the private rented sector, which Wokingham has not accessed until recently, and we are trying to increase the access to that. And we are getting a really positive response at the moment from local agents. We had one landlady with 65 properties she'd given to Reading approach us in the last 2 weeks, and is willing to offer the next 10 or 15 to us, which is really positive.
Stephen.
Very quick word in addition to Zulfikar's. He's absolutely right, of course, that the initiatives taken with the private rental sector is perhaps the biggest single thing we can do in the short term to deal with the temporary accommodation problem. But I think what you were hinting at, Laura, is the longer term. And the longer term, we just need more affordable and particularly social rental housing within the housing mix. That's vital. We live in an area where affordable is a relative term. A discount of 20 or 25% on a market property does not make it affordable to most people who are in need of housing. So we really have got to try and use every tool at our disposal to try and increase the amount of social rental housing, because that's where the demand is and that's where we're going to be able to do the most to help. The more affordable and social rental housing we've got, the less pressure there is on the temporary accommodation, the less need there is for emergency accommodation. So in the long term, that has to be the goal.
Thank you.
Pauline?
Just a couple of questions, Ulrika, just so I can understand the figures. On page 20, the approaches number, is that the valid approach, or is that possibly people that don't have a local connection? Is that just the people with local connection?
No, that's all the people who are approaching the council. So what we do is we go to take through them the eligibility criteria and assess if they're eligible to apply to us. So if you take back to the earlier question of local connection, for example. So by law, the Homeless Reduction Act, which came in 2018, we have to take applications from everybody, and then we've got 56 days to assess those and make a decision.
So the ones that are actually valid, is that the next one down, the homeless number?
Yeah, that's the ones where we've actually accepted.
The valid applications. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think I'm trying to understand David's question about the graph on page 23, because I think the graph on page 23 is probably line 1, not line 2. So it's the applications, not the valid homeless. It would be really interesting, Zulfika, to see what your graph for your extrapolation of valid homeless is as well, as opposed to the applications. The applications measure your workload, I understand that, but I think the valid applications is the one.
Yeah. We can provide that. We can do for provide that figure for you.
Sorry, did you?
I think we can provide that, but at the moment, I think there was a slide which I said we've took 42 acceptors out of 300, which is where we have to accept the statutory duties. But I can do some more work on the trends for that if you want.
Thank you. That just be useful, because that gives us an idea of what demand we're going to have to satisfy. I've no doubt it's going in the same direction. Yeah, but it would be useful to know. And finally, I just wanted to clarify what you said. So you're saying if somebody's applying for housing, they need a 5-year local connection.
To go on the housing register. Housing register, yes.
Housing register, yep. So, but if they're homeless, it's 3 years. Is that right?
3 years as a local connection test, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zulfika. My questions relate to the average length of time in temporary accommodation, which currently sits at 23.6 weeks. I wonder if we know what that number is if you remove the family who've been waiting for temporary or in temporary accommodation for the last 265 weeks.
Yeah, no, we haven't done that calculation, but we're happy to extrapolate that data for you. But
yeah, I just think it would be really useful to see it without that number, which is clearly skewing it in a direction, because if that you take that number out and it then goes down to 13 weeks, for example, then actually I think most of us can understand somebody being in temporary accommodation for 13 weeks while we try and get them back on their feet, find them additional housing, permanent solutions. But 23 weeks feels like a very long time for somebody to be in temporary accommodation.
Well, we're happy to go and do some more extrapolation and come back. So I've got.
Yeah, I mean, and then I guess the other part for me, it would be then from whatever that number is, what is our plan to try and reduce that number?
Okay, the plan is in the last 2 slides, which are solutions. We've got basically the only alternative tenure is private rented sector, so we are trying to access that in every possible way, through leasing, through guaranteed rent scheme, through negotiations with landlords. And the other thing is trying to prevent those numbers going into to the homelessness kind of cycle, if you like. So we're having really proactive conversation with the landlords. As I said earlier on, if we've got an eviction, we ask them what their intentions are. Are they going to re-let the property? Are they going to go and look at the private rented sector? And if there is any chance of us re-procuring that property or procuring that property to by bridging the gap in the rental market, that we try and sustain that. The other big, as Stephen's touched on, is in increasing affordable social housing. And I've touched a lot in whether we use planning frameworks, whether we go to registered providers or developers. So that is the ultimate solution, isn't it, to finding more affordable housing? And that's something obviously within the housing strategy we're aiming to do. And I guess the last one is basically around sort of looking at sort of alternative options out of borough, which we haven't started any work on, but we will be exploring at some point. Give the choice, out of choice. A lot of London boroughs, for example, are going as far as Midlands and North to offer people options. We haven't gone down that route yet, but that might be another option where you can get 2-3 bedroom house, for example, with a garden for a family that wants to resettle and build their lives again. So we are looking at further innovative solutions as well.
Thank you.
Go on.
Hi. First question I have is around the homelessness demands, where you've got the family no longer willing to accommodate. I just wondered what the main instances are behind that. You know, is this people turfing out their kids, or is it turfing out the grandparents, or you know, what are the circumstances?
The majority of the time it's a family with a daughter or a son with usually 1 or 2 children, where they've accommodated them. It's got to a situation where they're no longer sustainable. And as I said, during COVID, a lot of negotiations took place with family situations to say, do you really want to turf your son or daughter out with your grandchildren? And we've sustained a lot of tenancies in that. So in the majority of cases, you'll get on average either a couple with a child or a daughter with 1 or 2, a single parent with 1 or 2 children, where the relationship is completely broke down, or in some circumstances where children now reach school age children, and it's not sustainable for them as an environment, and parents can no longer sustain them. Many relatives who've accommodated for some time, and they're refusing to sustain them any longer.
Okay, thanks. And do we manage to resolve a higher percentage of those than other cases, or less? You know, how successful are we in resolving those situations, or helping resolve those situations?
So that's a fluctuating situation. We've used mediation services, for example. We have a relatively good level of success in the past. At the moment, if you look at the trends, it's increasing because a lot of people are refusing to sustain those relationships. So it's kind of, I'd say, one that is very difficult to predict, but we've had some success in saying, actually, if you keep them for 3 or 6 months, we will work on them on long-term permanent solutions. We've had recent cases where actually following our intervention as part of our preventive work, that people have actually kept people there for another 3 or 6 months, where we've looked at alternative solutions. Some of that, for example, have been to look for alternative private rented accommodation, and they've worked with us to find those solutions as well.
Some of this, Norman, I think is connected with COVID and coming out of COVID. COVID both obliged people to stay together, but also provided the conditions for driving them apart. And I think the lockdowns in particular put enormous pressure on a lot of households and relationships. And so what we're seeing is that coming through the system and creating a problem for us now. I think that's a contributor to all of this.
Thanks. I just have something from a slightly different angle then. On the grant funding, the homelessness prevention grant and the rough sleeper initiative, especially the homelessness prevention grant, you've got the amount for this financial year. Is that a sort of fixed thing going forward, or is it demand driven, or you know, how do we fund this overall?
So up to this year, it was annual funding. This is the first year we've got a 3-year settlement. So we know that we've got that level of funding for 3 years, and it helps us plan our services basically. This is the first year we've had a 3-year settlement. Up to this year, we were getting annual settlements, so we didn't know if the government would actually renew that, but we've now got a 3-year settlement.
So it's also adding, I think that that funding has enabled us to take on some really good people, very, very skilled. And we've got a lot of really impressive young people with great talent coming through in the housing department, some of whom are funded through these streams. So we're very, very fortunate. We've got these high quality people really making a great contribution.
Great, thanks very much.
Okay, Chris.
Thank you. Firstly, my apologies for my tardiness. I've not quite got used to driving on that side of the road again. I have a minor question about the Ukrainian sponsors for Ukrainian refugees. There is an anecdotal entry in social media at the moment about a young lady who's looking for alternative accommodation because her sponsor no longer wants to look after her. Is there any process that we've got in place that allows the sponsors to contact the council to let us know what their views or their plans or their objections are, so that we get a feed up front about problems before they actually arrive?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of processes in place. We've got a very well-resourced casework team that has weekly contact with the sponsors, which actually speaks to the hosts and actually gives them the opportunity to raise any issues that they want in terms of emerging issues. And that's been successful across Berkshire. It's been a model that other authorities are trying to emulate, because what we do is we have weekly contact and establish if there are any issues and try and nip them in the bud. So some of those, for example, our relationship breakdowns is pretty low compared to our neighbouring boroughs, authorities basically. And we have a proactive system. 3 weeks ago, we had an event for all hosts and guests. We invited hosts to come along, and 2 guests, for example, came and presented the positive aspect of how good the communication between the council officers and them has been. So they've got a number of avenues. We've got a dedicated email address. We've got a dedicated hotline for hosts and guests to contact if there are any issues that emerge. And we've been proactively engaging with both the hosts and the guests to look at long-term solutions as well, and that process is well underway. Some of whom are coming up to 6 months, for example, to find out what their aspirations are.
Thank you very much.
It's also worth adding, Chris, that we're in the fortunate position where there are still people who have offered to be hosts who haven't yet got guests, and so we can kind of reallocate people, which has been immensely helpful in actually reducing the pressure of the kind you're talking about.
Okay, any questions for any other members? Pauline.
Sorry, I can't reach this button. Just something that suddenly occurred to me, Zulfikar. The homeless or the asylum seekers hostel in Early.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if that generates any demand, or is that being satisfied in another way?
That's a Home Office contract, which the council has no responsibility for, although we have got involved in cases where there's been a need, for example, in children's cases and assessments. But at the moment, the contract is between the Home Office and an organisation called Clear Springs, where we don't have any responsibility at all, and hasn't generated any homelessness applications from there. And it's unlikely to generate them, because part of the plan is they should have move-on accommodation, what they call dispersed accommodation from the hotel, which is again part of the contract with Clear Springs. So Laura Clive and I visited a couple of weeks ago, and we got some really useful information out of them as well.
So that's very interesting. I'd be interested in finding out a bit more about that. Thank you.
Okay. If there's no other questions from the members here, I do have some questions. So I'm just having a quick scan to see if anybody's got any other questions. No. So thank you for the presentation. My questions are, with a workload of 50 per person, is that a reasonable workload for someone to be under? And do we have any staff stress?
Yes, we do. It's not reasonable, and there are staff stresses, but we are actually working on a casework management plan as we speak to do kind of redistribute. We've actually got some recruitment ongoing at the moment to increase the level of staffing in prevention of homelessness, and we are addressing those caseloads with a target case of 30 cases per caseworker, which is the industry norm.
Okay, thank you. The associated question was if someone goes off sick because of the stress and so forth, that has an impact on the service, but it sounds like you're actually on the ball there, so thank you. With regards to the connection to the borough, what I presume if someone hasn't got a connection, you don't turn them away, but actually point them in the right direction somewhere?
Absolutely, yeah. So we will oblige by law to take the application, assess it, and if, for example, if they've come from another borough where they do have, we establish where their local connection is, and we have a statutory duty to refer them back to that borough.
Thank you. With regards to private landlords, is there any sort of review of the suitability of the accommodation to make sure that it's maintained to an adequate standard? And then I guess there's associated costs to us to ensure that.
Yes, so we inspect the property for some under the what we call the health and safety standards. So we have to request a number of documents like gas, electricity, EPC, the certificates to make sure it's complies with the health and safety regulations. And we've got support from our environmental health team if things do go wrong to actually go and inspect and make sure that that service is sustained. So we have a service, property service standard, which we give to landlords that we expect properties at.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, I do. Yep, I'll pass on to Andy.
Thank you. Zulfikar, I'd just like to follow up on your last comment, because I'm not sure if you're aware of a case which Shirley Boyd raised with somebody in your team where a resident had been sent to temporary accommodation in Slough and it had cockroaches. Now they had all the right certificates. So my question is what physical inspections is the team doing to make sure that property is up to standard, rather than just
with that was probably like with bed and breakfast cases, the presentation on the day. Then we place them and we try and inspect within 3 days to go and get an inspection of those properties. But we also rely on what we call self-certification. If in that particular case, if that was a regular supplier and we found that it was a common occurrence, we would continue to use them. But on before placing, we would ask for all the certificates, like you said. If we satisfy the certificates, then we'd place and we try and get there within 3 days to actually inspect those properties as well.
Can I just follow up on that? So have you actually, whatever we were doing wasn't working in this particular case? And I appreciate the family was rehoused very, very quickly after that, which is good. But I'm just wondering, are we going to be doing anything differently to make sure this never happens again? Because I can't imagine anything worse than thinking you're going to be looked after by the council and then suddenly you're in accommodation with cockroaches. We can look at, as your colleagues, but the resources is a big issue. And what we do with emergency accommodation is basically that sometimes on the day we have a difficulty in accommodation. For example, about 2 months ago, we were placing as far as Milton Keynes and Coventry because we simply couldn't find any accommodation nearby. So if it's a day placement on the day, then we rely on the goodwill of the supplier. And as I said, if we discover they've given us information that isn't correct, we would probably seek not to use them again. Again, my last question on this. So this particular resident knew Shirley via other circles. So she called her counsellor, but it strikes me that not everybody who is in this position will know a counsellor. And I'm wondering what support or encouragement are people to give to actually get back to whoever has placed them so they can report this and get it done straight away. Because my fear is people in accommodation, they're thinking they're down on the luck. They might not have a particularly good relationship with the officers and they will just live with it. So that's my, what do we need to make sure that doesn't happen? This person was lucky, they knew Shirley. So every person that we place has a caseworker, a named caseworker.
and they should be able to access that caseworker. I can reiterate it to the team to make sure that we place them well. So when we place them, we give them the contact number of their caseworkers, and they're able to contact their caseworkers with any issues that emerge, whether it's about temporary accommodation, whether it's about the assessment of the application or any other issues. So they will have a named caseworker when they're placed. And I can reiterate to the team that we need to ensure there are issues with standards, that they alert the caseworkers. There's a process in place for them to contact the service and the caseworker.
Okay.
I just one last thing. It's not a question. I am tempted to say that sometimes it's not just about the processes and having a number. It's about building a relationship. And I appreciate it's not always the easiest thing to do.
Yeah,
that might be something worth.
So one of the things we're doing, sorry to interrupt, is that, for example, currently cases in temporary accommodation bed and breakfast are now getting proactive contact from us rather than sitting there and waiting for something to happen. We're actually having proactive conversations on their aspirations, the likelihood of them getting social housing, because all of them sit there in the hope that they will get social housing at some point. So we're having proactive conversation, and that's a result of our sort of increased intervention to not to let people just sit there and wait. So we're having proactive conversations.
Sorry, this was less about the longer term rehousing and much more about they've been put in some accommodation and that's terrible. Do they have the confidence? That's the thing I'm focusing on.
All I can say is that we try and do all the statutory checks. We ensure that the property meets the required standard. There is a property standard. If we do discover, then we will act on it. So the case you're highlighting is an exception rather than the rule, basically. So we don't get many complaints because most of our suppliers do conform to our standards.
Okay, good. Stephen?
Just to come back on Andy's point, I agree with you entirely, Andy. It's not about process, it's about people. And we do need to make sure we're in the position where we're offering people in a desperate situation the best possible help. What I can say with absolute confidence is that all of the housing officers I've met with have got real passion and commitment and really want to make it work. They are very much on the side of the people who are in difficulties. And I've not met any who, in my view, would not go that final mile to make it work. So, I think we can have faith, not just in a process, but in the people who are trying to implement it.
Okay, any more, Andy? No. Okay, I do have one follow-on from Andy's question in terms of it is a failure mode of the provider in terms of giving an adequate accommodation. It might be useful just to record over a period how many failures in that instance we see, because if we find there's a set of landlords who are taking advantage of the system by providing rubbish, we need to be aware of that.
Yeah.
My other question relates to like the Groveland's idea, which I think is an excellent idea, but the integration with the existing community, because I know there was a little bit of angst with the Groveland's community. So with the plan going forward, if you are going to provide such units, I just want to make sure that you are going to have a communication plan with existing residents, not to upset a community.
Absolutely, and we're already looking at having a welcome event for the local residents to welcome once the units are fully occupied. We are going to have an event which is a community welcome. Meet your new neighbours. We're planning an event, and we've got regular communication with the residents anyway to try and address the concerns they've got. And we've got a communication board where we regularly pin up, and there's a contact number of who to contact, named contacts as well.
I think just to add to what Zulfikar said, a lot of work has been put in the Groveland scheme in trying to address the legitimate concerns of existing residents, and I think we've actually done a lot that I think they will feel comfortable with. These are difficult relationships and they have to be managed as carefully as they can. But ultimately, obviously, our responsibility is to try and ensure that we get more temporary accommodation available. And the Groveland scheme is wonderful. If anybody's not been to it and doesn't know much about it, I really urge you to contact the housing department and visit before it gets filled up, because the standard of accommodation is really high. and it's a really impressive scheme.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Right, I think that's the end of the questions there. So I've just got kind of 3 actions. The graph with the trend is actually include the actual line of the number of homeless people in there as opposed to the number of contacts. Work out the number of weeks people are homeless, taking out the outliers, so we get a good average as opposed to one that's skewed. And then record the number of bad landlords, I put bad in quotes, or bad accommodation that we see, so we just actually make sure we don't get a trend there. Were there any other points that the committee would like brought recorded? I'm getting no's. So thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to the next one, medium-term financial plan overview, 2023 to 26. So I believe we have 2 short presentations from Clive and Imogen, and then going on to Graham.
I was just going to say a couple of words to orientate ourselves to the process, then hand over to Clive, then to Imogen, then back to me to do the presentation.
Okay, that's fine.
Right. Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's that time of year again where this very exhaustive process takes place through scrutiny, but I would like to also inform you that an awful lot of work, as in previous years, has gone on to get to this point. And just to give you an illustration of the amount of work that's gone on, twice we've gone to directors to say, we have a really challenging position next year. You have to find all the savings options you can. You need to reduce your growth where you can. We've gone back to them in order to get more greater challenge and a greater set of options. We've also, on top of that, supplemented that with corporate-wide initiatives called organisational foundations. So that was a third, let's say, endeavour to try to find the options that we could. So, and all this work has been critical in terms of bringing CLT working alongside the lead members executive. So I can't stress really how much work has already gone into getting to this point. Obviously, I'll go through the slides in more detail and explain the substance of what's in there. But the reason for stressing that is, as in previous years, I think it's 3 years, maybe 4 years now that we've had these sessions with overview and scrutiny, is really, really imperative on us to recognise the importance of trying to come up with solutions in the challenge. All challenge is great, but if the challenge means we just take out all the solutions to get to the resolution, then of course the deficit just gets bigger, and then we have to find somewhere to balance the books. So really, that's just in terms of. Sorry, I know it's quite a mix in terms of the audience. There's some very, very experienced, long in the tooth, and I use that in the nicest possible way, members like myself as an officer, but I also appreciate there's quite a few new members as well. So when I go through the presentations, I apologise for those that might have heard this many, many times, but I think it's important that we bring as many people up to speed as possible in this crazy world of local government finance. And I don't just mean the economy and all that stuff, but it's not the same as private sector accounting, although there's similarities. So I will try to explain the acronyms and the idiosyncrasies as I go. If you feel that you're lost on any point because I'm using terminology, then by all means jump in. I think it's really important that we all kind of feel comfortable that we understand it enough in order to then be able to challenge in the most useful way. So, and in that spirit of challenge, the more we can find in terms of extra income, extra savings, and the more we can reduce the growth, then of course, the better the position becomes. So I won't go on any more about moving to the particular challenges we're facing in terms of the economic and the local authority challenge. I've got some of my slides, but I think it's important that you hear from the leader of the council and the lead member of finance now in terms of the context leading into this challenge we're facing for setting a balanced budget next year. So I'll hand over to Clive now.
Okay, thank you very much, Graham. And can I begin by thanking all of the officers who have been working very, very hard on these budget proposals for the next 3 years. And I know that they have put on an awful lot of effort into this, and I'm sure that will become apparent as this overview and scrutiny committee look at all of the proposals over the next few months. So this is possibly the worst, most difficult year in the last 40 years for putting together a budget. As Graham said, we have challenged officers to find savings, and we will continue with all of those challenges over the next few months. So we really are facing quite unprecedented challenges, many of them not peculiar just to Wokingham. So in my new role, I have regular meetings with council leaders from all over the south of England. So these are council leaders from all political parties, and without exception, they are all saying that they are really, really concerned about the challenges that their own council is facing in putting their budget together for the next 3 years. And there was one council leader that I spoke with about 7 days ago, who is very experienced. He's been a councillor for a long time in a Shire county, and he said that it was horrible, and that he was looking at big deficits in his council's budget, and he was very, very concerned that inflation is going to be a massive concern. When we finalised the budget last January, inflation was 5%, well, I think 5.6%, and now it's getting on for 10%. And many commentators are suggesting that it could be 18% next year. And of course, every one of us on this call in this room will be hoping that that is not the case. We're all hoping that inflation goes the other way, so that it makes our life easier running a council, but it also makes the lives of all of our residents very, very, very difficult We have another big issue, and John Kaiser spoke about this a lot over the last few years, and I absolutely 100% agree with him that giving us a local government settlement the week before Christmas is just so bad. It is no way at all to be running any sort of business or organisation like a council, to tell you just a few weeks before you finalise your budget how much support you're going to get from the government. It's just not on. It's been happening for far too long, and these one-year settlements, you just can't really plan properly. So I've written to the Secretary of State for levelling up housing and local government, and asked him, and I know a lot of other council leaders have done this as well, asked him to bring forward the settlement so that we know a long time before what they're proposing at the moment, which is probably the week before Christmas, so that we know sometime in November what our settlement is going to do, and also making a plea for more than 1 year settlement, so at least 2, and wouldn't it be nice if it was 3? So that's really all that I want to say in this initial meeting. This is Imogen's meeting. I just wanted to add some context from the conversations that I've had with other council leaders, and to thank all the officers in the council who have contributed to where we are initially with this budget, and to thank them for their work that they're going to do over the next few months, getting us to a final stage of a balanced budget in late January, February. So thank you very much, Graham.
Okay, thank you, Clive. If you don't mind just turning your camera off, so we don't have an issue with the camera. Thank you. Imogen.
Yep.
Okay, I think that we can all agree that we're here to serve our residents, and to do that, one of the things we need to do is we must deliver a balanced budget and keep this council financially viable and running and delivering the services that we all expect. But obviously we've got a problem with the rising inflation and depleted reserves, which is meaning we're all having to make some very difficult decisions going on how this council is run. Graham Ebbers, our Chief Financial Officer, gives us advice on what we need for a safe budget, and it is clear that what we have and what is about to be presented to you, that it's rather untenable, and it will push us below safe levels. As mentioned, our officers and lead members have worked hard to get us this far, but we need to go further. So, and as it stands, we can only raise our council tax by 1.99%, which won't touch the sides when it comes to inflation. And we're also tackling problems such as refugees and a history of poor planning decisions when it comes to people moving in the area. And we cannot assume that central government will step in to help us out. We cannot assume that they're going to give us grants or funding to sort out our problems. And as Clive has alluded to, I'm aware that this problem is affecting many other councils, and my other half's deputy leader of the fire service, it's affecting them, and a whole bunch of other public services. We also have a large looming bill around the reforms of adult health and social care, which is where us as local councils are expected to pick up more of the adult care costs ongoing. Central government will probably provide us with some funding, but it's unlikely to be expected to cover all of us on the health and social care bill. Part of how we got here is started due to a mix of COVID and Brexit, and the grants that we have received during COVID didn't cover everything. And because Woking Borough Council has the lowest amount of funding per head in the entire country when it comes to council spending, instead of making savings, it feels like the previous administration chose to take the money from reserves and hope that things would recover after COVID. But unfortunately, as we know, there was a war in Ukraine that started, and just as things were beginning to recover, and this has significantly affected our fuel prices internationally and causing inflation to spiral. And we are also now supporting a large number of Ukrainian and other refugees, and we have migrants coming from Hong Kong. So combined with the history of poor planning for school places, and where the new homes are being built, this has caused an excessive number of children to wind up being bussed around the borough. And we also have a shortage of SEND school placements, and a whole catalogue of these things have escalated into the problems that you're seeing now. So there are two key areas of funding to look at, capital and revenue. The capital funding is for projects that involves tangible items, such as roads and buildings. Some of this funding will come from developers, some from government grants, and the rest has to be found from other income sources like borrowing. The problem with this borrowing is that the interest payments come from revenue. And as it stands at the moment, we have a £14 million gap on the capital programme required for next year. So we need to ask our officers and our lead members if every project is necessary or can it be delayed for later years. I might add that our SIL money, which is the money coming from developers, is currently only able to cover around 60% of the project work that's required. Revenue is the funding which we use to pay wages, electricity bills, disposable items, and the essential day-to-day business of running this council. Revenue is largely funded from council tax and the income streams such as car parking and leisure fees. This is where we have the most pressure, and we are trying to cover over a £4 million gap next year. As I said, our council taxes are capped at 1.99%, and therefore the revenue and things like from car parking, leisure is down, while inflation costs are rocketing everywhere. It is clear that people's work habits have changed during COVID, and car parking income in our towns is only back to 90% of the pre-COVID levels, but the park or ride services have not recovered at all. And our leisure facilities are not fully returned to pre-COVID levels either. And we also have problems with bus services suffering from lower passenger numbers and increasing fuel prices. And many of you'll know that we've had to put some extra funding forward to prop them up, basically. There are some things that I despair over. Winnersh Park and Ride started before COVID, and we committed to finishing the project. Millions would be lost if we didn't continue. But a problem was found with the water main mid-project that added an extra 1.3 million to the project. This was not known in October 2021, but for some reason it was not included in the current budget. You will also get to see the growth bids for each area. These need to be looked at in the terms of where will the funding come from to support them. With our limited ability to raise revenue funding, we need to ensure that the priorities are set correctly. If we agree to growth, what will we not do instead? I do feel for our residents and the hardships they're experiencing with inflation. This has affected COVID, affecting the council too, but the best we can do is serve them is trim this budget so that our costs are as low as possible. But we also must remember to protect the vulnerable and those that are in the most need. So this is where we're going to need all of your help. We need your help to asking the questions of our officers on their spending priorities. We need to get the feel for what palatable changes can be made and where we can make savings and increase revenue. We may need your help in that. We need your help in setting a workable, balanced budget, and we must be making savings, increasing revenue, and readjusting the capital programme. So please ask the questions that any member of the public might ask, and please have no fear in whatever you ask. At some point, we do need to look at restocking our reserves, but I'm not sure how that will happen without a longer term change of direction on how we generate revenue. So do watch out for these items and help them develop and grow. In this meeting, we will be starting with a strategic overview of our situation. In the following meetings, we could drill down with each of the directorate and ask questions of the relevant officers and lead members. I shall now let Graham do the talking.
Okay, thank you. Hold on, Graham. Just want to say thank you, Imogen.
Sorry. Yes, thank you. I obviously I've got the slides and I will run through them, but I think I'll just focus on particular points within a slide rather than you feeling you've received context upon context upon context. I think it's pretty clear what's going on here, and we're in the same position as Clive said, as local authorities up and down the country are really struggling, and I have presided over more than 30 budgets. I know that's hard to believe, but of course I left straight from school. This is really is this set of circumstances I've never seen before. So we've got impact of COVID, impact of Brexit, impact of a war in Europe, impacts of all sorts of other things, and they manifest themselves in so many different ways. Obviously, we have to borrow money like other people. We suffer from obviously contract uplift, supply chains, mental health issues, care issues exacerbated through COVID, etc. So all of these things, and of course, the more vulnerable and the more needy, then the more the demand on the local authority. So we've got our almost like our income pipeline, either contained or suffering, particularly, for example, in leisure is a really good example, and will continue. People have to make choices between their leisure subscription or maybe funding their electricity bills, those types of things. So some of our lines of income are suffering. Our council tax is capped, but of course also suffers because more people are defaulting, will default. At the same time, the costs are going up. So it's not a happy alliance of circumstances by any means. So I'll just race through the slides.
Question. I'm sure everybody else does too. Do you want to take them one page at a time, or do you want to take them at the end?
Whatever works for you.
I prefer one page at a time, please.
Okay. Start with this.
So the problem we have with that is if we have loads of questions per slide, we're never going to get through the slide deck. So are they? So if everyone has questions on one slide, the same slide, that would be good. I think I'd rather go for the whole presentation first of all, and then we'll ask the questions because we might get answers to those questions as the presentation goes.
Okay. Right. So on this one, we've talked about the rising demand, and obviously we had Zulfiqar here with Stephen talking about housing pressure there. Impacts also. We got really big impact on send, and it seems to be getting worse by each week. And we have, like I say, the impacts of curtailed income, and I'll save this for when we come to adult social care, but unless you've got any questions about the health and social care reform, we still don't truly know what that means, but all the calculations we've put together in terms of its affordability are pretty scary, to be honest. What I would stress as well, although we've been working on this budget for a long time already, by the time we sent these out and this meeting here, things have changed. I mean, something changed today, didn't it? So what impact does that have on the economy? Actually, interest rates went slightly down. But if you just think what's happened over the past weeks, well, what's going to happen over the next weeks? And the big unknown, of course, is the local government finance settlement. So just stressing, this is the best we knew at the time we put these figures together. And what we'll do is we'll come back and we'll update at a sensible point in time so that we're not just constantly giving you new iterations. This is just particularly for those new to this committee. In the report, I said about 80% of the council's spend is on statutory services. That's really important to understand, because when we have to save, say 5% or 7% or what have you of our net budget, that's really hard to do in statutory services. Therefore, the pressure falls on those budgets outside of adult social care, children's services, environmental services, waste and recycling is statutory. Grass cutting probably isn't, obviously not popular if you don't do it. But even those places, if you choose not to do, it's going to have an impact in the community. So you see straight away, adults, children's environment, you've got the lion's share of the budget there. An awful lot of those are statutory. Highways and transport, some areas of discretion there, but areas difficult as well for the community if you reduce your highways maintenance, that type of thing. They're very visible things. The democratic process is here to support all of those things, like this committee here. It costs money. So quite a lot of money goes into the whole of the infrastructure, which is the democratic process. And there you have a relatively small amount on other frontline services. So this is one way of looking at it. There's all sorts of different, we can give you tables, kind of P&L accounts and all sorts of things. But this is something I've just pulled out of the newsletter that we distributed last year. So this is out there in the public domain, but it gives especially those new members a sense of this is where the money goes. So I've talked just before I go into the detail on revenue, just a simple way of explaining the difference between revenue and capital. So this building here, Shoot In, if we built it scratch, that's a capital. So it'd be multi-million pounds, doesn't have to be multi-million, but it's usually very sizable in its cost and it's a one-off, it's built. That's called capital. Revenue will be the cost of the lighting each year, the cleaning each year, the staff that run out of it each year. So revenue is like your ongoing cost that just keeps running on, but obviously can move up and down, depends on what decisions you take, and the capital is a one-off. There are, of course, lots of crossovers between revenue and capital. Probably most significant is if this building was half funded through borrowing, then the ongoing costs of borrowing, the interest. In private sector world, this is called, you also have depreciation. We don't have depreciation. We have the repayment of debt called minimum revenue provision. This sounds dry, but this was actually what brought Slough down, minimum revenue provision. So it's about paying off a sufficient amount of your debt each year in a safe way. And at usually the lowest it can be in the general fund, revenue is 2%. So it's a bit like depreciation. It's effectively the cost of your asset flowing through to revenue each year. So you have that MRP, minimum revenue provision, plus interest. So say right now, and I wouldn't be saying these figures last year by any means. So MRP, so if it was a 50-year life asset, that's 2% MRP. Then you add the interest on, which is at PWLB rates right now, 5.5%. So that's 7.5% is the ongoing revenue cost that flushes through. So you borrow, and then 7.5% of that flushes each year through the revenue account. That's one of the biggest linkages or considerations of revenue and capital. The other, of course, sometimes, well, I say sometimes, wherever we can, we make capital investment in order to make revenue savings. Good example is if our dementia care home, savings are either you generate income or you avoid costs, has the same effect, and they're both credits in our revenue account. So by building our own dementia care home, we avoid costs each year, which are much higher than the cost of borrowing. Therefore, it's a good thing to do financially, as well as, of course, a good thing to do for the customer, the user of the service. Similar, say, solar farms, that is a capital cost, but the cost avoidance that we realise through doing that, or the income that we generate from on selling, is significantly higher than the annual cost of borrowing. Having said that, of course, any of those business cases that were marginal 6 months ago, obviously probably not looking particularly clever right now. But that's hopefully an understanding of the revenue capital, and that's, but happy to go into that in more detail. Right, this is just the view of looking at the departments. And I showed you on that little picture of how they kind of gone up, but adult social care. So it's the net position, and it's saying that when you look at the income and look at the expenditure, the net position is a net growth of 469,000, which of course is very, very modest for the size of budget adult social care. And then you see the other directorates have credits, which means set aside everything else that I come to. Within the work that's gone on, I talked about, we went back to departments twice. We said, come on, you've got to do better. We've got to balance the books. Every area we've managed to achieve a net credit, as in a contribution to the challenge that I'll come to later, other than children's services that are suffering acute pressures in particular areas, homeschool, transport and care being the two key areas. You'll see, and as you should see and look out for, the pressures in the revenue monitoring, you would expect many of those to start flowing through into the following year. So if we're struggling with containing homeschool transport in the revenue monitoring, you should be looking out for a growth bid in the following year. We then we've obviously done the same thing for the next 2 years. So it's a 3-year medium-term financial plan. These figures are cumulative. So this line, so year 1, we start with, and it's not meant to be pejorative in any way, but the gap really just means the ongoing expenditure exceeded the ongoing income to the tune of £2.3 million, which effectively means £2.3 million of the balancing of the budget came from one-off sources of money. That's what it means. And obviously those one-off sources of money are then no longer available the following year, so they create an opening challenge. We then add to that the figure that you would see on the previous table, the 990, which was the net growth across all of the directorates. And then introduce an eye-watering, but still I would say incredibly challenging figure to keep to of just shy of £9 million. I think that's a real risk, and it's going to be a challenge to keep to that figure. We then, so you'll see in year 2, we then add another 6 million, and then so on. So it's cumulative. Council tax increase, we've assumed at 1.99%, and that's the cumulative. So about 2.5 million, and then a further 2.5 million to give you 5 million in year 2. Adult social care, 1%. That isn't guaranteed. Additional council tax base, 1.5% increase. So this is new houses, so new developments, and then we do an average band D on that. So that's 1.5% increase, which we've tailed off a bit. But of course, house building is currently going to struggle at the moment. Social care grant, adult social care reform. This budget is based on the fact that we will only spend on adult social care reform the amount of income that we get from the government. So that's what that represents. And the same with children's education reform. Obviously, there will be an adult social care and children's services session, and you can obviously drill down to that in more detail. And then we've got what's called organisation foundation savings. That is, these are 6 corporate-wide initiatives, which is around assets, and sweating our assets, contracts and procurement, being as tenacious as we can be, getting the best deals there. Workforce, so this is how can we make efficiencies through our workforce, redesign, etc. Hold vacancies, that type of thing. We've got business intelligence, the customer experience, and communities, working with our communities and the voluntary sector. There are 6. Now, some of those don't easily talk to savings. Some of them can create and should create savings, but they're not necessarily going to be there tomorrow. A good example would be asset rationalisation, and others maybe we can get at quicker. For example, contracts and procurement, but sometimes that's not easy if you're caught in the very long dated contracts, and your negotiation with very sizable companies that can be a bit more hard-nosed and difficult to deal with than others. You've also, of course, got the care market, and I'm sure David here and Matt Pope will explain how difficult it is to negotiate and contain the care market, particularly in this day and age. So that gives us a £4 million problem with all of these options that are assumed that you'll see. So we've assumed that they will all be taken. That's not a political decision. That is a mathematical calculation. So all the options that will be presented to you, they've all been assumed in getting to the £4 million. So if any of those income lines that you'll present with fall away, then that £4 million gets bigger. And obviously as new growth comes in, the £4 million gets bigger. And I guess I can't say strongly enough the amount of challenge that's already in here. And I think containing within £9 million inflation, for example, is going to be really, really tough. So special item. Oh.
Could you use your microphone?
Sorry. Yeah, sorry, Gavin, I understand you said on that last chart, years 1, 2 and 3 are cumulative going across. But on the budget gap, is that cumulative or is that a gap per year?
No, it's cumulative. So it means the position actually improves. So if we balanced all of year 1, if we found the 4 million,
yeah,
we also would have solved the problem for year 2 and have a few pounds in our back pocket.
Okay.
However, what I would stress, in all the years I've done this, year 2 usually gets worse as you move towards it, as does year 3. But based on all the intelligence we have right now, I know it looks odd. You would expect it to go 4 million and then maybe 6 million and what have you. But actually, if we overcome year 1, then on the face of it, we're in a good position for the whole 3 year, subject to all the variables that might happen. Special items, so you know, they're a bit like capital in that they're one-off, as in you just build a building once, but they're revenue type projects. So they're more, you do a small project or survey or what have you, it comes out of revenues. You can't capitalize it, but you tend to do it once as a discrete piece of work, although some of these carry on for some time. But that's the difference. Revenue growth is in the base, it's ongoing. Special items are just one-off calls of money. I'll just do capital then. So this is telling us that, taking into account the mid-year capital review that we took to executive earlier this year, and a refresh of the bids and the income that we think we can generate, we have a gap which is effectively, it is the same size gap as that was previously a year to now when we set the budget in February this year. We had a £14 million residual challenge in what was year 2 then, that now becomes the year 1. So although there's been all sorts of movements, the gap is pretty much as presented in the MTFP that went to council in February, and then becomes more modest in the following year. Obviously, we have to set a balanced budget in year 1. Some of that solution may well be passporting to future years, but of course, in many ways, that just kicks the problem into the long grass. So ideally, we need to find additional income or decide what we're not going to do. But a solution to creating a year 1 balanced budget is to postpone, let's say, and review. I think we've covered most of those. Collection, COVID, local government finance settlement, inflation, public health grant and new homes bonus are part of the local government finance settlement. New homes bonus, we're quite vulnerable on. The government have given strong indications of maybe phasing that out, and this authority has benefited well from new homes bonus in the past. And for those who don't know, SIL and Section 106, they're developer contributions. Section 106 tend to be the more historical ones, and there's a specific contract for a more particular piece of work sometimes in a particular area, and SIL are much more free-flowing and flexible in their use. Then health and social care reform mentioned, and I've already said there are challenges already there, quite significant, that leaves us still with a £4 million problem. Just so you know, and you've got the full versions in the pack, you'll receive a template that looks like that. That's a summary. Full version, like I say, is in the pack, which is kind of like the business case for the bid. So you will receive those with the agenda. We'll try and get them out before if we possibly can, but they provide the intel that hopefully assists the challenge and justifies the bid. Same with capital. That's the timetable. We're here with the strategic overview, then we'll get place and growth, end of the month. Then the corporate, which is chief execs, resource and assets and organisation foundations. Then you get adults and children. Then, really helpfully, having gone through all that, we'll get the local government finance settlement. Yeah, that's right. We might have to go round the circle all over again, but hopefully we are cautious enough so that any changes are helpful rather than leaves us in that very predicament. So yeah, that was it. So we may have to put something in January. We just got that kind of penciled in, I think, haven't we? But plan is to get it all wrapped up before Christmas.
Okay,
I'm sorry, that's it. Thank you.
Okay. So the way I propose we deal with this is, because it's a strategic overview, is ask if we've got any questions that are high level first of all, before we then dive into slides. I'll go around the table as I've done before, and then we will then go into maybe one question each, so then we can actually find out the slides. I'm just conscious of time and actually getting into it. And if we do find there's a niggle in a slide, we'll dig into it. So we'll take it like that, sort of free flowing. So we'll start with David, high level question.
Thank you. Graham, thank you, and Imogen, thank you very much for that very stark presentation. My question is this: when do we get out of this? I mean, my background is business, local government, finance. I mean, numbers add up, whatever. But in a very simplistic view, if this was a business, we'd say our costs are rising annually between 5 and 10% for as far ahead as we dare project. Our income is capped at 2%. If this was a business, we're going bust. So I was interested by your view that on that rollover chart, that if we sorted out the 4 million deficit this year, we'd be okay in subsequent years. But I'm wondering how that is true if the costs continue to rise or inflation sticks with us at anything like the current rates.
I can answer that. Good. Sorry. I mean, Graham might give you a more technical answer, but I know that we've got various, obviously people's habits and things have changed during COVID. We know, obviously, with car parking and things like this being an issue. We do have things in the pipeline. I know that you guys were probably going to see something about the solar farm, for instance, which has got quite a lot of revenue attached to it if it takes off, and it's looking quite good, and that's still got to go through scrutiny. But there's a number of projects and things in the pipeline that we have that is aimed at turning this around. But of course, we can't do that in 1 year. You know, it's something that is ongoing. But there is definitely plans in progress to tackle this problem. Graham wants to say anything.
Well, on one level, in answering that question on behalf of the local government community, is if it carries on this way, and already some authorities are there, first of all, you'll end up as an authority only providing statutory service at the absolute basic minimum. Some authorities, and you might have heard the termination of a Section 114 notice. Obviously, Slough announced that, but others have before. And I've heard that rhetoric across the country louder, more commonly used in different forums I've gone to, more now than I've ever heard before. I think as a system and a finance, it's broke because you can't have, exactly as you said, how does it work if you've got your income maximum at 1.99%? Just take pay award was 4%, and others you got 10%, 20%, whatever. I do think I think this local government finance system is going to be really important in terms of how it addresses the local government community. So that's a broad picture. What I would say is at Wokingham, we're a long way from that. And obviously we would do everything we could with all the work around the table and beyond to not be in that position. And the answer is being as radical and as imaginative as you could. It is taking the tough decisions of the car parking, for example. You ever put your income up as high as you can in obviously a sensible way. And income generating schemes, as Imogen said, solar powers, you have to get your dementia care homes, reduce you have to take risks. I'd say even the town centre regeneration, massively risky, massively costly. But when that comes to fruition, and it's had a few bumps in the way, COVID didn't help. So you don't have to be risky as a council. You have to be innovative, but yeah, that will bring, when we manage to wash down the debt sufficiently, then that will bring large millions of pounds into. So it's all those sorts of things and more, but making sure we take all the tough decisions on whether it's generating income, but also where we make cuts, because like I say, ultimately an authority is driven to a statutory minimum delivery service. So and there's been rhetoric for many years that authorities are heading for just being an adult social care, children's services, waste collection, that's it. So obviously we have to do all we can to avoid it. Sorry, that was a long.
No, that's all right. Statutory provision, from what you're saying, we are talking about adult social care, children's services, collecting bins on a basic level, some licensing elements. I'm just thinking, what else is in it? Libraries are not statutory. Is library statutory?
It's really difficult, this statutory, because there's all sorts of, first of all, statutory services can have different levels to it. So, for example, you can collect weekly, you can collect bi-weekly, but it's statutory. But there's same with adult social care thresholds, albeit the more actually you move away from the minimum, the better it is often, because you move into prevention, and prevention is much better than receiving the issue when presented. As for libraries, I know there's some rules, guidance, could be statutory, I'm not sure, that says you must provide so many libraries within so many of, yes, within conurbations, what have you. So there is, I have seen libraries, but yeah. So when you start working for it, there is not an awful lot, whereas you can look at and say that's genuinely discretionary. In the main, it's usually level of statutory delivery often is your choice.
Okay, very quick.
Yeah, I mean, where I was getting to with that is, take party politics out of it and all that, as difficult as that is. If I was sitting opposite you as a finance director in a private company, I don't doubt that the previous administration went through a very similar process this time last year. I don't doubt who's in power next year and the year after that will keep on doing the same sort of thing. There comes a point when you run the rag absolutely dry, and the finance director will be turning around to me and saying, guys, we need to reshape the business. Now, hopefully we're not there yet, but at what point do we get to the stage of saying all 52 councillors, many there are, sit down and say, this is what we want Wokingham to look like 5-10 years down the road, and we better have a plan to get there, because otherwise, as you say, we'll be following some pretty horrible examples.
I think the point you're making is absolutely a valid one, but I might also point out that pretty much every council in this country is looking at the same view. And so the question is of our government is, what are councils going to look like in the future? And that's what they seriously need to think about. And really, we're stuck with what the government is giving us really at this point. All we could do is do the best we can, but you could, I mean, obviously we've got property investments and things like, well, I mentioned the solar farm, but it's, should we be using public money in that way is probably a big question anyway. Should we be gambling with public money in this way? But at the moment, that's what we have to do.
Yeah, if I could just answer, it's a really good point you make. I'll answer in two ways. One is, in a more micro level, we are reshaping our business all the time, using technology, reorganizing ourselves and all that. Outsourcing, insourcing, share service. So that has happened year on year, going back many years. The more fundamental question, I think, is that local government, including this authority, needs to consider strongly how it becomes an enabler, a facilitator, a coordinator of the social capital of the community to meet needs, and maybe step away more, obviously in a managed way, from maybe being the direct provider and funder of things. So it's kind of almost trying to renegotiate with the community the expectation of the local authority in terms of what it will directly fund and provide versus its role as orchestrating the social capital of the community. If that makes sense.
Okay. Al, I think no. I'm just going around the table here, so say no. Andy, this is yeah. Laura, can you put the microphone on?
Apologies. It sounds as if I mean, long term, this council's always had to deal under pressure with being the lowest fund authority in the country. And officers, I think, have a culture of being innovative and focusing on value creation and getting good returns for residents. It sounds as if there's probably a number of other councils who haven't been under those stresses before and had that culture. So they'd probably go through even worse scenarios before this council. And now they would probably present themselves to the government in that way before. So are we sort of hopefully more at the back of the queue as having serious issues as much as this is very sobering?
But without a doubt, Laura, first of all, answering your first point, yes, we have for many years done all those, which is great because it means we have the capacity and capability for change and the know-how and the mindset to embrace. And of course, we need change upon change upon change. So if one has been a more traditional authority, just getting into that rigor of good governance for change and delivery, and we've got a good, strong track record. So it's great that we can tap into that, and you'll see funding relating to change will come through in the corporate session later on. Yeah, your second point is, without doubt, there will be authorities far in front of us of the queue of going to the government saying we need to be helped out. Certainly on revenue, the council taxpayers revenue account. Now, just to illustrate that, when CIPFA, Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountants, that's the accountancy body that oversees local authority finance in many ways, and they do a resilience index, and when they did that, we were in the top 20 in the whole of the country in terms of the most resilient, and they go through all these different factors in analysing that. So that's the best kind of empirical data I can use to say we are in much better shape than other authorities, regardless of what I'm presenting you here. And I do know, speaking amongst my counterparts in other authorities, they have gaps of £15 million plus and don't know where those answers are. So yes, it's tough. And remember, there's a lot of embedded challenge in keeping to the 4 million. But I know many other of my counterparts would love to be in the position we're in, no matter how stark it looks for us.
Okay.
I would imagine that you've been talking to other councillors in different authorities as well, but I certainly have, and it's very clear that we're not in the worst place, not by far, but we're not in the best, but we're not in the worst. And our problems largely are geared around the fact that our income per head is quite low, and that's what's making it a bit worse for us, but certainly we're not the worst.
Okay, Pauline, anything?
Just a couple of questions. Firstly, where do I find commercial income in this sheet?
So go to on revenue.
Yeah.
In result.
Yeah.
Sorry. If you go to the page I've just put up.
Yeah.
Within that 509, there will be growth and savings, and you'll see those when they come through.
Correct.
So when we do the corporate one, you'll get to see commercial income. However, I would say the commercial approach, obviously commercial is quite a wide term. So for example, Optilis, managing Optilis, getting better, I would say is commercial, as is, I would say, is building a solar farm is commercial. But if you're talking about as in assets, then that will come through in the corporate session.
So the town centre income, the solar farm income, any increases in solar farms and the resulting income will be in resources and assets.
That's correct.
And the cost of providing those assets will also be in there.
Yes, expenditure is like the growth and the income impact will be in corporate services.
Great. Second question on related to that. For new households in the borough, do they break even in terms of the amount of council tax they pay and the amount they cost us?
Well, ultimately, the new ones, it's an impossible calculation to do, but ultimately, if you take all of them.
I didn't mean individually, I meant in total.
I know what you mean. So, okay, let me try to help explain that as best I can. Right, so so what we're saying is with new houses, which is additional council tax base, we're saying we'll bring in 1.9 million pounds extra next year because of the additional council tax base. So the question that you're asking effectively, Pauline, is all those people that are going to go into those houses in that year, will the services they call off the council be more than 1.9 million pounds?
Yeah.
Impossible for me to say. If they bring in children with high special needs, homeschool transport.
I'm basing it on your estimates, Graham. So you've got an estimated increase of expenditure of X and an estimated number of extra people of Y. If you strip all the inflation and all that other stuff out of it, will the growth in income from the extra houses pay for the extra demand? So the volume-driven demand. Well, you can come away and tell me later. That's fine.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I could ever give you the answer to that because it's easy to arrive at the council tax base estimate like that, and it is only an estimate.
Yeah.
And of course we could look back as well, but we don't track. So if you do it, the only way to do it with factual correctness and certainty is to say let's look at last year.
Yeah.
And then we can see how many, but then we'd have to look at every one of those houses and calculate what they called off of the council services in terms of extra costs on.
Can I just jump in there? I think this is a question that is worth asking and actually then coming back with some estimates.
Yeah.
Because I think there is some finagling you can do with the numbers to actually give an upper bound and a lower bound. They may not be accurate, a high degree of accuracy, but they give you something.
A feel for it.
Yeah.
If you take all the inflation out and all the growth out and just concentrate on the unit cost, you've got more units. Is the unit cost going up by more or less? That's all I'm asking.
I think, as Graham said, it's going to be difficult to calculate because you don't know if they're coming with children. You don't know.
But you must know.
So
what you
I'm going to stop the argument.
You're going to start setting up bin collections and things.
Imogen, sorry to be difficult here. It's a case of you know what the population is of the borough. You know what the population of the borough was the previous year and the previous year. You know what the budgets were and you know what the increases were during those years. So then you can make an estimate for those times. And it is an estimate. It's just an understanding. So, and if you go away and work out those figures and actually come back and they're absolute nonsense, that's fine. Because I think as a point, it's worth discussing, but it's not worth spending a lot more time on it when you can come back and actually say, here's some figures, they're rubbish or they're not.
Okay, I'll do that, but I do think it's nonsense because the only way to work out that average is effectively you take the whole of last year's budget and you prorate it over the population, but that's not going to tell you anything. So all it's going to tell you.
Can I just say, it doesn't allow any, it doesn't change any decision making.
No.
So why bother?
No.
I think if you have any normal business knows how much it costs to service a customer on average. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'll do it. All I'll say is I'm not sure it's going to. All right. I'll just do it. Okay.
I mean, if we had no residents, would we be in a better position?
I think the answer to that is yes.
Well, yeah,
Right, so going on to Gregor. Sorry, yep, thank you, Ollie. High level question, please.
Yeah, one question and one frustration. My question is there any local government settlement built into these numbers at all? So if a local government settlement comes in at, let's say, for argument's sake, 2 million, just for the sake of argument, the gap would then go from currently 4 million to 2 million. Is that correct?
The assumption is that the local government finance settlement we got last year and this year will be replicated next year.
Yeah, and I'm hoping for that. Don't get me wrong. I just want to know whether or not that is built into these numbers.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
there is already an assumption of local government settlement built into this. So even taking that into account, our budget deficit is 4 million.
That's correct.
Okay.
Just to stress though, our local government finance settlement amounts to 0 revenue support grant, retaining, I think it's about 12, 14 million of our business rates, and I think 3 million-ish of new homes bonus. So what so it's not, we didn't receive nothing overall because we were allowed to keep some of our business rates, albeit we collect 60 odd million and we're allowed, but we still were allowed to keep some.
Yeah, no, I remember that discussion from last year and the year before and the year before. Yeah. You'll also remember this discussion from last year and the year before and the year before, Graham. On their page 40, where it's got the breakdown by the different departments, please can we have the budget for each of the departments? Because right now, I cannot tell whether a 1.1 million saving in place and growth is 1% year on year net, 3%, 5%, 10%, 20%. It would be really useful just for context to be able to see the actual budget for each one of those departments as the effective second column.
You okay with that, Graham?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, no, Norman.
I think you partly answered the question that I had, was the effect of other things like the new homes bonus. You said the public health grant, SEWL section 106, and you talked about the government settlement. Are they all, as the assumptions, all that they carry on as they are now, or are there any changes in those affecting the 4 million?
All those things you said, new homes bonus, business rates retention, RSG, and public health grant, yes, I'm pretty sure they are all assumed to roll over at the same level. We might have made an adjustment on new homes bonus because we knew that that was tailing away to a certain point. So substantially, yes, unless we knew of either minor changes because the scheme was tailing away or because we've been told there's a certain percentage uplift that have been guaranteed. But there's so much actually, even if things were said to be, this is what we're likely to do, obviously the landscape's changed so much, even that we do with extreme caution. The one thing I did in all of that we haven't been told, and we didn't have, I can't remember, I don't think we had last year, was the adult social care precept, because the adult social care precept was given for 2 years and we used most of it in 1 year, in the first year, and a residual element. So the fact that we've introduced 1%, oh, where have I gone now? There we are, is different. And I'm thinking surely that will be, we'll get at least the ability to do that at an adult social care precept. I'm pretty sure there was a 2 or 3 year deal and we landed up using the residual amount and it was a fraction of a percent.
So for all those figures, which of the sessions will we see all of that sort of laid out so we can have a look at that? That'll be the resources and the assets.
Yeah. So if you want to see the assumed income, yeah, we can, that's probably the best place to bring it in, those, yeah.
Okay, Chris.
I've just got one thing I want to get clarified in my mind. It's about the SIL money in the S106. So these is funds that have come in for specific projects and activities that have to take place. And delaying them can affect our budget reserves. But in delaying them, we also can possibly increase the cost of delivery. So how bad are we in that position? I think you mentioned we've got 60% of what we need at the moment, or in funds.
The number of projects on the table that are expecting to get SIL money or S106 money it's woefully below the actual amount of money that we're getting in. And of course, we're dependent on developers. S106 usually has strings, much more strings attached to it. You know, you've got to build X in a period of time. SIL money is much more flexible and we can use it in different ways. But I know that we haven't got enough SIL money to meet the demand of all the things that we have to build. So we can delay things because obviously we've got the capital programme there, which is, you know, we're going to have to do something. So some projects are going to have to get delayed. But obviously we need to be wary of what are the strings with that SIL and S106 money and how long we can push it off for. And as you say, the costs will no doubt go up. Yeah.
Are we talking about capital now? I was confused about the question and the answer.
So if I rephrase the question, the question is about the fact that we're looking at some make savings in our budgets. We have funds that are sitting in the bank, S106 and SIL. They're earmarked for particular projects. Now, saving that money or reallocating that money to bail out an essential service, like for argument's sake, the buses where we had to use 106. Can I finish? So the question I have here is, if we do have to delay other projects to reallocate those funds to prop up other essential services, what is the knock-on effect? Are we already at that point where we have more to do than we have funds to do it with?
We are in trouble in that respect. I believe the buses was done with S106, and we took the view that they were vital to certainly people who don't have cars, and generally it means quite often it's low income people, elderly people, people with disabilities who can't drive. So we were supporting vulnerable people, so we took the money to use some S106 to do that. I don't believe we can use SIL money to do that. I'm not exactly sure. It has to be S106, but quite often developers give us some S106 to start a bus service in a new neighbourhood. So I know that in my ward we have the Matthews Green Estate. There is some S106 that is allocated to putting a bus service through there, and they're waiting for the population to be big enough. So this money has been allocated for that purpose.
Only the last point, I think the question was, do we have more commitments and expectation than resources? And the answer is yes, to the tune of plus 4 million on revenue and plus 14 million on capital. And that's the heart of our challenge.
Okay, so what I suggest we do here is actually just step through the slides and ask pointed questions on the slide. So if we go back to the beginning of the presentation, so we've gone through strategic context. So the next one, we don't need to go through that one. All right, Andy does.
Just a very, very quick one. I mean, I don't know who came up with this graphic, but it's actually quite misleading because the democratic process and the text used underneath it is misleading residents because they think it is just the cost of councillors and just the cost of meetings. What that heading actually is, as I'm sure you appreciate, in the MTFB is actually the Chief Executive's Office, which covers a far broader range of services than just the democratic process. So I think the text around that one should change just to help residents understand what that 10% of the budget is, because the idea that 10% of the budget is just spent on the councillors and the meetings is not particularly accurate.
I think you'll find it includes updating the electoral roll. I think it includes HR, doesn't it? And
I know what it includes, but it's not. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that is included which isn't democratic.
it's customer services in there. I think it is.
Okay, so I think we've taken the point on that one. So, okay, we'll move on to the next slide.
Sorry, can I say, I take the point, but this comes out of something that was published about 6 months ago, so I can't change history, but I can take your point going forward. Cheers.
Okay, so I guess that's the easiest question for a slide. So go on to the next one. Right, so starting with this slide. So I'm going to slowly look round to see who bites. So I'm getting no eye contact. Oh, Polly.
I presume we'll get a lot more detail on what's driving the growth in children's services when we get the detail of children's services.
Oh, absolutely. This is just the summary, and behind whether you'll get all of the individual growth bids, special items, savings proposals and capital bids, and the total budget by directorate.
So the thing that interests me is this is a large amount of growth in year 1 and then very little in year 2 and 3, which looks a bit strange.
Yes, I think there are some challenging savings plans in year 2 that is doing a lot to curtail the additional growth, and obviously you'll get to see that.
I think what you find that I was saying is talking about the SEND provision. We're obviously building a new SEND school. I'm not sure when that's scheduled to open, but obviously that will have an effect. Yeah.
Okay, so next slide. Pauline.
Thank you. Not on the spur of the moment, but could you split out the inflation into pay award and contractual inflation separately? And could you explain whether the pay award is just pay or whether it also includes the number of heads? And could you give us a trend of the number of heads that the borough will have, say over, I don't know, the last couple of years plus going forward? I'd just like to understand and tease out what of this is actually pay inflation, what is cost inflation from contracts. I believe this year we put 8 million into the budget for contract cost inflation, roughly. So I'd be interested to see how much of that is next year. And likewise, I'd like to see the trend in the number of heads, please. I see that adult social care is showing us cost neutral, whilst Imogen just said that it won't balance. So which is correct? And I'd like to see a list of assumptions, please.
Okay. In answer to your question, the breakdown on inflation is 2.2 million is general contract inflation. And I will give the slide for this. About 2.4 million is pay. About 0.6 million is utilities. 1.8 million is adult social care market. And about £1 million is pension. 2, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm a bit light. I'll find the rest. But
so thank you very much, Graham. That's great. So if we, again, as Gregor said, if we could have the base that that's based on, that would be useful because then we can see what percentages are. And I'd still like the number of heads, please.
Okay, sorry. First, on the number of heads, there are no additional heads in that figure. This is just inflation, not additional staff. Additional staff will come out through a specific growth line. It won't be lost in inflation. So I didn't get your Let's do the adult social care and I'll come back to the other thing you said. So the adult social care, you said it can never be done within budget or something like that. Is it? No.
No, I didn't say anything about adult social care at all. What I said was, Gregor's point that you've seen the increases in each of the individual areas now. So we've got 2.2 million general inflation, 2.4 million pay inflation, etc. Can we also have the base budgets that go with that so we can see what percentage it is? So what's our current pay budget? What's 2.4 million in terms of a percentage, etc.
Yes, understand. Yep.
Is it Pauline? Okay, Gregor.
For the line that says foundation savings, 2 million, 3.2 million, 4.2. I appreciate that there's 6 areas that is based around assets contracts. Will we get visibility of each one of those areas and the savings that are coming from them?
Yes, they'll be itemised in the corporate session where we'll show all the 6 organisation foundations and the expected savings over each of the 3 years.
So when we do that in the contracts and procurement session, I'm sure that there is every intention of trying to get contract savings as part of that, but contract savings in the time of inflation, in my own business career, I would look at you, do my professional flinch, drop my pen and then laugh. So it'd be really interesting to see the assumptions that have been made in terms of those potential savings, and then also the impact that we are seeing through inflation. That's in no way to criticise the work that's being done. I just want to understand the assumptions that have gone behind it, so that if we can genuinely say there is a contract saving to be had here because of, that's great. We should go absolutely all out in order to get it. If, however, what we're saying is there's going to be across the board contract inflation, we need to recognise that as well.
Yeah, and you make a really good point. And that's why I said that £9 million is going to be a challenge just to keep within that. And this is saying not only are we going to contain within the £9 million, we're going to take 2 million off it. Makes it an even headier challenge. I think in those discussions, clearly, it's not simply going to be, we're not going to pay you inflation. There's got to be, what can we do differently? Or how can we help you to be more successful? What can we do to help you that allows us to negotiate something better? What I will say is we've engaged, we're in a public meeting, so I won't name the outfit, but they are really impressive in this field. And I've worked with quite a few, but these are really impressive. But of course, the proof's in the pudding, and they're soon to have some big conversations with our budget managers, with some of our bigger contractors. So watch this space on this. You're absolutely right. It's a challenge, but it's wholly responsible thing to do, isn't it? To try to do everything we can to reduce procurement and contract costs, because assets is harder. And then where do you land up? You know, you land up having to make cuts and what have you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my point here is what I don't want is a false negative on a line. So we're saying we're going to be able to get 3% saving out of contracts, when actually it shouldn't be that. We should just write it down as 0 and at least start from the worst case scenario. The other question, you just raised it in what you just said there is, you know, I know that our council does spend a lot of money on external consultants for doing a lot of different things. You know, there are things that we as a council cannot do ourselves, and I totally accept that, and we go to experts and specialists to do that piece of work for us. It would be very interesting to understand, as part of this process, how much each of these departments are spending on external consultants versus external work being done, because I would assume that that's going to be quite a large bill, and then the question would then be, do we actually need to do some of these pieces of work, or can they be pushed back to later, in the spirit of challenging everything?
Okay.
I think One of the things I would like to say on it is, I mean, obviously our energy contract got, we were going to discuss the energy contract at the exec meeting last Thursday, and it got pulled because the government changed the cap on for local councils. So everything's so much in flux at the moment and changing a lot. It's very difficult to put a nail in the sand, if you know what I mean, because things are changing around us. I get what you mean by the contractors and the other things. I mean, certainly in the areas that I deal with, I've been saying, why are we hiring these people a lot? And I'm assuming that our other exec members are doing the same. Saying, why have we got these people doing these things? It's an easy target, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't dispute using contractors when there is a valid reason for doing it. So, we know nothing about building a solar farm. Let's be totally honest. We don't. We're not experts in it. We're experts in providing services, great services for our residents. So we should be going to people who know stuff about building solar farms and saying to us, hold our hand while we build our solar farm because it will save us more than it will cost. It will appear as a cost on our P&L. Don't get me wrong. It will, but it will save us money in the long run, and that's the right thing to do.
And it's important to get, in the case of the solar farm, it's to make sure that they're doing the job right. That what is being, the options are chosen are the right ones for us. But yes, I totally agree.
Absolutely.
Okay,
I just want to make sure that
we've agreed on this point. So can we got another question? No. Okay. No one.
Yeah, just following up on one of the things you said, Graham, about the inflation. There was 1.8 million in adult social care in there, I think you said. Is that inflation on current services being provided, or has that got some growth in the amount, an assumption of growth in the amount that we're going to be providing overall?
No, the figures I gave for inflation are just that. If there's increase in volume, it presents itself as growth, demand growth.
Chris, anything? No. Okay. Next slide.
Thank you. I mean, I'd be intrigued to know what special items are, but maybe that's another story for another day. Because the general picture on that chart, we're taking a lot of hit in 23, 24, and presumably then the cost of those particular items disappears or dissipates through subsequent years. But is there not a risk that, life being what it is, future special items as yet unknown, undetermined, will occur, and that we ought to be making some kind of provision in the budget for unknown unknowns?
Okay, well, starting with the provision for the unknown unknowns is probably best referred to as the general fund balance. So we hold a balance of about £9 million. That's based on budget risk analysis. It's not a pure science, but ultimately is there for the unknown, as it were. There are some particular reasons why these figures reduce. So I take your point. I'm not going to say for 1 minute this time next year that 24, 25, 1898 hasn't pushed upwards. But there are, say, as a look at chief execs, there's £1 million to come off. There's a particular reason for that. And we'll obviously do this when we get to corporate, but something that had always been accounted for or budgeted for as special item, like the change infrastructure team, all of that. We used to treat as a one-off, and albeit is 3 years worth, but then we'll stop. But I think we're recognising here that we're going to mainstream it. It becomes part of our general establishment rather than maybe more traditional thinking that you just got a change team in to do that project for a couple of years, but actually change is a constant, and obviously, a necessary constant now. That's an example of maybe partially answer your question of this nuance between a special and a growth and what sorts of things are in there. There's other things like we have to do major set pieces around planning, core strategy, that sort of stuff. So that's a particular piece of work that happens, and then we have the start, or there might be transitions. For example, you're moving from a shared service, moving to, or have you, and you have to do the implementation work to achieve. So that hopefully, I mean, of course, that doesn't explain that huge figure of 4.7 million, but you'll get to see all that detail over the coming weeks and months.
Help.
Can I just ask about, voter ID? Is that a cost in here somewhere? And is that a one-off special cost that's going to cost to provide equipment or whatever through the changes in that are being brought in for voting?
I would say I wouldn't want to ruin your surprise for when you get the corporate services, but honestly, I can't remember if it is or not. But if there is a growth required, that's where it will appear when we do the corporate services. That has all of the governance and elections costs and what have you. So
I think save it for that meeting, for that level of detail.
Laura, Pauline, Gregor, Norman, Chris. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm doing the eye look trick. No. So, Pauline.
Graham, just for interest, could you remind me what the budget and outturn for this year, or even last year, you can't do the outturn for this year, was in terms of capital? From my recollection is we always over budget and underspend and push stuff forward.
Yeah, on capital, we definitely underspent, and there's two types of underspending. There's the real underspend, so you're not going to have to. It's not a delayed expenditure, but there was a real underspend. I can't remember the size of it. I think 10 million-ish. Oh,
just confirm for us later. That'd be great.
Oh yeah, sure. Yes, we'll just dig out the capital outturn.
Yeah, just so we can get a sense of it, because these figures always look a lot bigger than they end up. For two reasons: one, late delivery, which means late booking of capital, and the other reason is underspending.
Yes. Sure. Oh yes, almost certainly, given historical performance, and we're trying to get better at it, almost certainly say that capital expenditure year one of 199 million was approved. First of all, it would be phased over 2 years. For example, school, well, you've got the whole budget, but you're not going to finish it all in 1 year. And then furthermore, even the phasing in year one, there would tend to be an under delivery against. To be honest, I'm really pushing for under delivery wherever I can, because capital borrowing is really expensive at the moment.
Ambitions exceeding expectations. Yeah.
Just one very quick question, Graham. Where would the solar farm sit in this? Is it place and growth or resources and assets?
I think resource and assets.
So if it's resources and assets, 75 million in year one, 2 million in year two, 3 in year 3, well, sorry, 5 in year 3. Does that mean that we're not building another solar farm after the first one, or are we just not planning it into the MTFP at the moment?
Okay. Yes, you're right. The one that we're doing delivery now is obviously little would be here, because we'd expect the expenditure to take place in 23. When we get to it, I think let's say certainly we want to do more work on. There is an ambition to do more. Obviously, it was supported through the council process, and therefore, why not do more? I'm not exactly. I can't remember how sophisticated the costings are in terms of incorporating them in the capital programme. but on one hand, I'm not too worried about that, because not only does it pay for itself, and therefore it doesn't, if it's not there, it's easily put in because it pays for itself and plenty more. I think the key thing is how quickly we could introduce them to then introduce revenue savings into either years 2 or years 3 of the MTFP. So you're absolutely right. For completeness, it should be properly costed and included in the capital programme. However, of course, it more than pays for itself, so that's not a worry. But then, of course, in terms of being part of the solution, it's how quickly does that credit come through. And I think year 3 is probably going to be the best we can bring out quickly. We can bring others on stream.
Moving on to the next slide. Oh, sorry, Al.
Sorry, could I just ask a dumb question really here? So reprofile from 22-23, does that mean like earmark reserves that are cash sitting in the bank somewhere?
No, it effectively means a scheme that was initially intended to be delivered in 22-23 is now slipping in total or in part into 23-24. So it's giving members the full quantum of the spend in 23-24, even though some of it might have been approved in last year's budget. That's what that means. Well, the whole capital programme would have been funded in 22-23, so it was wherever it was determined to be funded from them, that then is sitting around ready to fund it only a year later.
We don't borrow money until we absolutely need to spend it. So if it's got money that's scheduled there to be borrowed to do something, we don't borrow it until we absolutely need to. And pulling down the SIL money doesn't happen until we need to spend it as well.
Sorry, Imogen, I think Graham just said the opposite to that. Maybe I misunderstood him.
So if I can explain mine, and which will also go into Imogen's point as well. So let's take him, because of course not all funding is from borrowing, but let's take borrowing. So in 22, if we were going to do it in 22-23, we would have said, right, we're going to fund it by borrowing, but as Imogen rightly said, we wouldn't do the borrowing because we don't need it. So then going to your point, we then need it in 23-24, so we then borrow in 23-24 to fund it, as opposed to borrowing in 22-23. So we fund it from the same source. Now, of course, if it's section 106, then and we have received it, it's sitting in the bank account. We don't spend it in 22-23, we just simply roll it forward, ready to spend in 23-24 when we do.
Microphone.
Sorry, is that the same when we borrow money from ourselves?
It is. When we borrow money from ourselves, it's effectively our cash balances, it's our internal balances. So right now, this is it's absolutely important, isn't it? Is if we can borrow from ourselves, it's a much better thing to do than go to the market right now and pay through the nose. So I'm very keen to things to go as slowly as possible in terms of expenditure, so we have as much of our internal money available and thus avoiding the need to go external. So yes, that's a really important financial consideration right now.
Norman.
So given what you've just said about going slow, etc., when we get the capital programme figures, is there going to be some sort of prioritisation on items so that things that are going to generate income quickly, perhaps they can be relatively high up, but things that perhaps you would want to put off for a year or two, there's some sort of prioritisation, so when the line is drawn, when we know how much money we do have, then things will go above.
This is something we're hoping you'll help us with, so we can see where the priorities are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously something that generates more than its cost, and some of these things do, even though borrowing's so high, then we want to push ahead with those as fast as we can. Solar farms, for example. But yes, where it is a net cost to the council, we're going to have to cut a cloth somehow and weed out £14 million worth, or at least delay it if we don't weed it out. And yeah, I mean, Imogen's absolutely right. It's through this process we're trying to get there.
Okay, so the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, Polly.
I was just going to add to that. You said 14 million, Graham. My recollection is that 14 million isn't a particularly unusual size of figure for the capital budget. Is that right?
In terms of, let's say, a year 2 problem, no, it's quite. We obviously have to balance year 1, which of course we did last year 1, but to have ambition exceeding resources in a 3-year capital program is not unusual. It simply is that, ambition exceeding resources, and it's different to revenue because you just choose what you don't invest in, whereas revenue might be reducing level of services or whatever.
Okay, moving on to the next slide. So we're coming up to nearly 20 to 10. So yeah, I think this is kind of getting to the end of the questioning. So, right, looking around the table. Okay, so we won't forget you. Polly.
I just wonder if there was another risk that might be in here about continued refugees, bearing in mind the whole economic, well, the whole geopolitical position is not like where we'd like it to be. So I'm just thinking there might be another risk missing.
I think you may be right. If Putin misbehaves further, then yep, there'll be more of them. And I hope that we do the right thing, the humanitarian things, and are able to support these people.
In addition to that, unaccompanied asylum seekers and the percentage that we're required to take has increased nationally. There's a formula, and that formula's just gone up. So yes, you're right. They are, both those are risk around additional demand.
Okay, next slide. That's a template. Anybody? Andy.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. Thank you for everything you've done this evening. I just wanted to ask, I just wanted to understand a little bit more about how the bids are put in, and in particular how they're withdrawn rather. There was a bid put in last year, which appeared in one of these sessions, for the car parking revenue growth in car parking. And then the comment against the bid says that it's been withdrawn. And that the car parking issue later was in the MTFP approved in January, but it was there as a risk. So it sort of migrated from something that was going to be in the MTFP because it's been signed off by Pauline, for example, and everybody prior to her in the chain. So I was just trying to understand how stuff would then be taken out of the MTPF, how that process worked, how frequently does that happen, and what are the criteria for bids once put in and signed off at the highest level to be withdrawn.
Okay, if I can just explain the process, and I don't know if you're pointing at something that I'll miss here, but I'll try. Okay, so what happens is the process of getting all this together is a lot of work at through the departments, directors, the directors working with AEDs, etc., all of that good stuff. Also, corporate-wide work goes on. And then we get to a point, and this is overseen by a corporate leadership team with myself, and it gets to the point where we have done enough to have meaningful discussions with lead members, and then lead members introduce their thoughts, research, what have you. So all of that goes on, and then basically it's released effectively as this is sensible stuff worth putting into this scrutiny committee, and then it's released, and then it comes here. And that's it. And then from here is what this will be part of the shaping session, and then it goes into the MTFP. But nothing gets taken once the MTFP is approved. Nothing gets taken out unless there's an executive or council decision to take it out.
I think my question was more about, it's not after the MTFP has been approved. It's about leading up to the MTFP. If something would it be normal for something to be signed off by everybody and then to be withdrawn? Would it not make more sense to not put stuff in front of the executive member, for example, until it had been thoroughly reviewed? Or was that implying that the decision to take it out is actually made by the executive member, where all the officers had originally wanted it in? You don't have to talk about this example, but generally, because it seemed weird that something's signed off and then it doesn't make it to the MTFP.
I think also as part of the process is the executive in February receive the submission and agree to submit it to council.
Yep.
So ultimately, a lot of the shaping,
yep,
to use the term, is undertaken by the executive and the lead members,
yep,
because they receive it in order to pass it on to council. So if they're not comfortable with it,
yep,
they won't want to receive it.
So it's sorry. So in this instance, it would be or in another instance, the executive member has signed it off, but then it's gone to the collective executive, and it's been bounced back and taken out on that basis.
Yeah. So it never makes. So there's reconsideration of reflections, comments made, what have you.
Yeah.
So there's always the opportunity something here is taken out prior to be received by executive. Now, as with all papers presented with executive, obviously they're strongly influenced by what's acceptable or not to receive.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Just on all of these templates, Graham, could we have the budget included as well? So before we get to the year 1, year 2, year 3 expenditures and incomes, could we also have just a box that tells us exactly what the budget is to begin with, so that we can compare and contrast?
There's a theme here, isn't there, Graham?
There is. And it just comes from my business background. I just want to know what the starting point is, as well as what it is that we're doing.
Yep, Polly.
It might help you, Graham, as well, if there's a budget and an outturn, because sometimes you can massively overspend a budget, which might give a misleading, or massively underspend it, which might give a misleading view of what the inflation actually is. So the end year outturn might be useful, I don't know. It also might be more difficult.
Okay, next slide. Maybe quickly say, do we have any questions on the remaining slides? No. Just go to the date. So there's the, the date timetable. So I think it's going to be interesting. So I anticipate having some long evenings then. So eat well beforehand. Thank you. Okay. Do we have any final questions for Graham? No. I do have one sort of high level strategy one in terms of, are you looking at what government legislation and bills are coming forward that will impact both expenditure and revenue? I know we've got the Healthcare Act, but we've got changes in highway stuff. So I don't know whether you've got someone looking at that.
Always. So all of the growth and all of these savings opportunities are informed by changing landscape, which includes indeed government legislation, regulation, what have you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Clive. Okay, moving on to the work programme. So going on, we're on page 53 of the agenda. So just going through, the next meeting is an extraordinary one for the 17th of October.
Provisional. So
Provisional.
we need to, so this is the one that we need to ask members if they would like it. This is the one that's been rearranged from.
Sorry, I
September.
haven't seen that email.
Yeah.
So as Callum's correctly informed me, this is the provisional one due to the rearrangement of the previous one getting cancelled. So are we happy with the 17th, Monday, 17th of October? Yeah. Both. Well, contents have been decided because we were going to review them.
The only additional one's the bottom one. That's the one that the request from the committee this week.
Yeah.
Can I just say, Joe, it does seem the one on the voluntary sector is missing a trick. Surely the question should be if the voluntary sector is fit for purpose, and should they, where we are giving them money to provide us services, shouldn't we be scrutinising them for the services they are providing, and are they able to cope with what they're doing, rather than everyone saying how great it is that we're working together? Doesn't really feel like a scrutiny item to me. But I appreciate the officers may have already been told to write their reports.
Yeah, that's a worthwhile point. We can put that down to the officers coming to report. Is it actually worth it? Thank you, Andy. Okay, so yeah, we're happy with the 17th of October then. Yeah. Okay.
And just on that one, actually, on that voluntary sector one, the Borough Parish Liaison Forum have sort of put in an interest as well on this, and they've requested whether, because they've set up a small task and finish group to look at this issue, and they wondered if, as we've got an item, rather than duplicate officer time and work, if it would be acceptable if a few of their representatives could come along and just ask a few questions as well. Would that be acceptable to the committee, or other than that we can organise a separate session for them? But it would just seem,
No,
we've got a
I think
session
from
going on.
the officer perspective, it's actually saved them time, so let's do it once.
So I believe that they've set up a task and finish group specifically on the cost of living, but as this presentation would cover both things, it just seems sensible to get them to come along to one meeting rather than ask officers to present the same presentation twice.
So from an agenda point of view, do I put this at the front of the agenda?
Yeah, because yeah, I think so, especially if we may have, I'm not sure yet, I need to speak to Sally, but we may have representation from some of the voluntary sector as well coming along. So it would, again, so they can get off early, it would be, make sense.
I'd also like to put a time limit on it as well, because the local plan update could well be quite a meaty thing, and I don't want to eat into its time.
Yeah, I think we could, that's fine. Okay.
Laura.
Thank you. I think it would be well worth having someone from the Hardship Alliance come along. So I think if it's Citizens Advice or one of the others can't make it and it is just officer led, that perhaps we take this to a different meeting, because I think we'll truly get value out of it if at least one Hardship Alliance member comes along.
We've got another extraordinary one for timetable
for the budget.
26th of October for the budget. Then we go to the 3rd of November. Now, Rebecca.
Chair, I'm not able to make the meeting on the 26th of October, but I will send a substitute in my place. Although I may join it virtually as well, just to listen, because I don't want to miss part of the budget discussion and then force it to be recapped later.
If you find you have any questions beforehand, let your colleagues know. So we have one coming up on a third. Oh, sorry. Oh.
Sorry, I'm just looking. I knew I could see it somewhere. So the slide for timetable versus this one for the 26th of October, is that an additional item in there, place and growth, or is that what this MTPF is? So you're showing place and growth revenue capital for as a 26th October activity. Is that ours or is that someone else's? 2 sheets back, 3 sheets back. Before the templates.
Yeah, so the meeting on the 26th of October, yeah, that's to consider the both the capital and the revenue budget proposals for Place and Growth Directorate. So that's everything, including highways and things like that. Last year, just for a bit of context, Chris, that directorate specifically took a lot of time just because of the sort of, you know, the variety of different things that they cover. So it was sort of felt pertinent to give them their own meeting this time.
Okay, so on the 3rd of November, we've got a schedule here, but we have been considering doing some training for the members here for understanding about the domestic abuse programme that's going on. Callum has timetabled that on Monday, the 1st of October at 7 p.m. That's Tuesday, isn't it? Tuesday, the 1st of November. So
I emailed members obviously earlier today with a different date, but I've since had other members come back and say they can't make the original date, which I believe was the 31st. So Tuesday the 1st is the next suggestion, and it was felt obviously we need to have that. There's no point having the training after the 3rd of November because you will have scrutinised both of those, both domestic abuse and violence against women and girls items. So I wondered if members were available for that date, or if not, it was possibly a suggestion of what other dates could be palatable.
Yeah, so one of the things I was thinking of is, because that's another evening that would be taken out of our timetable, is we could do it via Teams during a lunchtime or do it earlier during the day. I'm just trying to feel how you guys feel about that. I'm just trying to be flexible because it's not a public meeting, so we can be flexible there. Chris?
I'd favour a virtual meeting rather than an evening meeting.
Yeah, it would be definitely virtual, but I'm trying to think about a time slot. Any preferences? Any difficulties with lunchtime with anybody?
Could be any day. Could do the 1st.
Yeah. So is that okay with everybody?
Yeah, well, yeah.
So, because then if I'm a different country, it still fits in.
Excellent, thank you. Moving on to, so we just covered a 3rd, so we'll have the training for that on the previous few days. Extraordinary meeting on the 29th. The bus service update, I know Laura's interested in that one. Sorry, that's been delayed again, but there's been various bits with reports. I think that'll be it, really. Cover the rest at a later point. Yeah, any other special announcements?
Just to very briefly update on the work of the task and finish group. They have had one further meeting since the last time that you've met, and they're going to be sending off a list of proposed interview questions to the officers, which they will then hopefully include and amend for their own for the interviews for the new preferred partners. So that's ongoing, and hoping to meet as well very shortly with Arch, who's the sort of the organisation that runs sort of provides a lot of support for retained social housing for local authorities. So we're hoping to speak to their chief executive officer, and then after that it will be speaking to service users and registered providers. And if I could just do one little plea whilst we're here, I did send out an email a little while ago asking for if any ward members did have you know, any anecdotal issues with social housing from preferred or from just registered providers. You know, if you do get any, please send them through to me, just so we've got an anecdotal evidence base. I will resend the email. But yeah, if we get an anecdotal evidence base, it's then easier when we then meet the partners to be able to say that we have heard issues including X, Y, and Z.
Do you have a date for that?
I will send an. I will
No, I
send.
mean, when would you like the email from?
As soon as possible. I will send a chaser up. I'll speak to the chair. I'll speak to Shirley and see what she wants.
Okay. Right, so I think that's the end of the meeting. So if anybody's got any questions, no, good. Right, so thank you all. Good night.